All right, students, AP US History students, our first live stream of the sorts. Welcome, everybody. I hope you guys are hanging in there. As we always say, hanging in there. I know it's been a crazy year, and it's not any easier as the AP season is upon us. But I hope you guys are hanging in there. As you guys get into the chat today, can everybody give me a thumbs up or a hello, just to let me know that you guys are here and who's here, and then we'll get started. The primary purpose tonight, or today, wherever you are in the world, is to try to give you guys a sense as to what the test is not only going to look like, right? The AP US History test this year, not only what it's going to look like from a digital form, all of the in-person, all of the written forms, right, were administered earlier in the month. So all of the digital forms that you guys will be taking for the AP US History exam, I want to give you guys a sense as to what that test will look like. It is a little bit different than what you typically see on a written test or in the written exam form. And then I also want to give you guys some strategies, hopefully, to the test is for a lot of you guys just in a few days on the 19th, right? And then there's another makeup test later in the month. But right now, I want you guys to understand some strategies that you can potentially use, not only to help you study, kind of last minute studying for the last 2 days, but also to help you guys see this test a little bit differently. Very similar to what we talked about during our SAT and ACT live streams. I want you guys to have that same sense. Okay, so again, just keep thinking about that. Keep that all in mind, and we will get started here in just a second. Once again, if you guys are if you're just joining us, please make sure that you just say hello or give a thumbs up, whatever you want to do in the chat, so we know who's here and we know we know who we're talking to and can address any questions you guys have. And then we'll get started here in just a second. Oh, cool. By the way, guys, for anybody that's watching this, I know we had some technical difficulties earlier. I apologize for that. But I know we had some technical difficulties. If you are one of the students that was logged on earlier and weren't able to watch live because of those technical difficulties, I, again, am very sorry. But remember that this recording will be available immediately after the video after the live stream is done. And maybe more importantly, we will answer any questions for the next 2 days until most of you take the digital exam on the 19th. We will be answering any questions in the comments section of this video. So if you guys have any comments, any questions, any concerns, just comment below the video and we'll make sure that we answer those. But once again, as you guys get into class or get into the live stream and get into the lesson and a review today, wherever you are in the world, please make sure you just say hello in the chat or give us a thumbs up in the chat so we know who's here, and then we'll get started here in just a second. Okay. One final thing, guys. I posted a sample AP US History test in the below in the video description. Okay, one of the things that we are going to cover tonight, though, is the difference between this test and what you typically take on a normal year, and then what a digital test looks like. Does anybody have any just general questions? Does anybody have any general questions about what that digital exam form is going to look like? Hopefully, all of you guys have downloaded the important information that College Board provided. If you haven't, let me provide that link for you guys. So College Board. Okay, because it's going to be really important that you guys have an opportunity to see the test if you haven't already. And we'll send this over in just a second. Okay, and again, the only reason I say that it's going to be important to look through that is because the digital copy is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past, at least from what we've heard from the College Board. Okay, so the copy of the digital exam, and it does affect your strategies. They're saying so that you can take it at home. They have to input certain security measures, which I understand, namely that you cannot go back. Right? They're stating that you can't go back to previous questions. Now that obviously sends a message that some of the strategies that we talk about with SAT and ACT work, if you're taking a digital copy of the exam, that creates some issues, right? Because typically we talk a lot about skipping questions and all of that stuff. So it's going to be important that while you don't skip questions, that you still understand the scale and that you understand where you are in the test. So time management is going to be crucial on this AP US History exam because you're not allowed to go back to questions, right? You're not allowed to jump forward, jump back. So can everybody again give me 2 thumbs up in the chat? If you don't see the chat, you should see it you should be able to see a drop down on the bottom right or top right of this video, of this live stream. For anybody that's watching after this, you guys will see the live chat up here, or you can post comments below the video. But can everybody give me 2 thumbs up if that makes sense? That according to the College Board, you will not be able to go back on this digital exam. Okay, the first one that was administered earlier in May was the written test form, but this one's going to be digital, and that changes things quite a bit in terms of the strategy we would want you guys to use, because you can't go back, right? You can't. You have to. You have to be really understanding of where you best, right, where you're best in terms of the AP US History test, in terms of the content. Tonight, there's not enough time between now and the 19th, right? 2 days on Wednesday, if you guys are taking the digital. There's not enough time for us to go over every single content piece. We're happy to answer questions. I've tutored the AP US History test for a lot of years. I really, if you've watched any of our SAT reading videos, I love the U.S. history passages. I'm a big U.S. history buff. I really like thinking and talking about this stuff. So I love this, and I've tutored it for a long time. But it doesn't mean that I'm not better at certain sections of U.S. history or enjoy certain sections of U.S. history more than I enjoy others. Okay, and that gives you guys a big advantage as you work through this exam on Wednesday, or if you're taking it at the beginning of June. It's very important that over the course of the next, let's say, whatever, 48 hours or 3 weeks if you're taking it in June, that you start to think about this test and where you are best, where you best understand, I should say, what's going on within U.S. history. Okay, does that all make sense? Does anybody have any questions about what I'm talking about there? Okay, and this is going to be, guys, this is going to be particularly important given the fact that on the digital copy, you're not allowed to go back on questions. Okay, it's very, very important. So any general questions? Any general questions there, guys? Everybody feel pretty comfortable? Okay, so if that's all the case, let's break this down, okay? And if you guys have any questions while we go, don't be afraid to ask those. And like I said, for anybody that's interested in talking about this afterwards and you just didn't get a chance to watch the live stream, this video will be posted as a recording immediately after we're done. Feel free to comment below the video if you do have any questions. And and we'll keep going from there, okay? But in the background of my screen, you will see the copy of the digital test form that I posted below. Now again, this is a written PDF. It's hard to obtain the digital copyright or to show it. Whoops. Okay, so it's hard to show this. But what I want you guys to think about is generally notes, right? I want you to understand where these certain things are happening, right? How do we best understand this exam, and how do we best understand where the content is going to be found on this test? Okay, does that all make sense? Hopefully everybody feels pretty comfortable with that idea, that thought. Okay, give me 1 sec here, guys. Any general questions? Any general questions about anything, guys? Everybody feel pretty comfortable? Okay. So potentially most importantly, as we go through this test, I think that you guys really need to strive to be focused on what you know best. Okay, what you know best. So let's go through the time periods that you're going to see within this exam form. Okay, the time periods that you're going to see on the AP US History test, and maybe more specifically, let's try to identify which of those time periods you know best. Right, this is going to be very specific to every student that's watching this. But let's go through every time period in which you know best. So let's all get ready to take some notes here. Okay, let's all get ready to take some notes. If I can pull this up, sorry guys, this is the same issue we were having earlier today with one sec here guys, sorry, I know this is a pain. I thought we had overcome it, but it doesn't appear that we have. One sec. I promise we'll pull it up in just a second. Any general questions just for right now, guys? General. Okay, guys, so this is just a general notes piece. Let's take a look at this. Okay, so what I want everybody to write down are the years, right? This is a really good way to prepare and study over the course of the next 48 hours if you're taking the test on the 19th. Okay, so let's all write down the general time periods that the AP US History test is going to cover. So the first period, right, and the one that most students struggle with, is the first period from 1492, right, to 1607. And this is the landing at Jamestown, right, the first colony in the United States. Okay, so that's the first period, and that's the one that students most often tend to struggle with. And again, as we write these down, it's very important that you understand, or in your own studying, which time period you know best, or which one you feel the most comfortable with. Period number 2, right? Period number 2 is typically outlined from 1607 to 1754. Okay? And I know that this all, as a basic general review, I'm sure that you guys have covered this in class, but I think it's very important that we continue to write this out and that you guys see this as a very, very kind of general scope of the exam. Period number 3, right, we have 1754 through 1800. This is a very, very important period, right, within American history, both covering the American Revolution and then the Bill of Rights, the U.S. Constitution, right? Very, very important that we take a look at that you are very, very familiar with 1754 to 1800 because a very, very significant number of questions will appear on that. Okay? The next one, period 4, right? Period 4 is generally considered from 1800 through 1854. Period 5 then gets into another kind of crucial part of the American story, the American history, right? Would be from 1854 through 1877. And I promise this will all make sense here in just a second. Period 6, right? Period 6 is 1865 through 1865, through 1898, I think. Is that right? Is that right? Yeah. 1898. Okay, kind of looking at that Civil War era, right? These are kind of a combination of the Civil War. Period 7 leads us through World War I and World War II from 1890 or so through 1945. And let's just stop there. There's things that you'll cover after that, of course, like the Cold War. But let's just stop there for a second because I think what this does is gives you a general overview of what these time periods are what you need to identify. Now, one of the things that I want you guys to think about is the reason that you have an AP course, right? What AP means is it's college level. And what that's really telling you is that the multiple choice questions in particular, and then the writing, obviously, the level of writing that you'll need for the SAQs, right, for the DBQ, all of that, the level of writing is obviously going to have to be elevated in order to obtain a good score like it would be for a college class. That's what an AP class is. Right? But what most importantly, when you get to the multiple choice questions, right? This is the one that students tend to struggle with the most. Okay, multiple choice. All right, as you guys get to the multiple choice section of this test, what you really need to think about, Andrew, thanks for the comment. Welcome back to the live stream. Okay, when you guys get to this, right, multiple choice, everybody seemed this is elevating your thoughts. Because the multiple choice section on this test versus something that you'd see on the SAT or the ACT, it's far less objective, right? It's much more subjective towards the time period. Namely, you're going to really have to try to extend your reasoning. So can everybody write that down? That the multiple choice on this section of the test is very different from anything that you've seen. And for those that have taken an AP English class, right, or an AP History class before, and then subsequently taken the AP test for that class, you guys will have a familiarity with what I'm talking about here in terms of subjective extended reasoning, particularly as it relates to the multiple choice section. Okay, does that all make sense? Can everybody give me a thumbs up if that makes sense? And the reason this is so important, obviously you guys can, you can start to cover content and you can do as much history review as you possibly can in the next 48 hours, but ultimately you're limited at some capacity with that, especially if you have a million other things going on, which I'm sure most of you guys do. So when we think about this, you need to write out these time periods. From now until, one thing that you can really, really help yourself with between now and in 48 hours when you take this exam is which of these, I would personally rank which of these time periods you know best. Okay, because if that's the case, it allows you to extend your thought process. When you see a multiple choice question that involves a diagram, for example, right, or involves some type of, you can be thinking in your mind, what does this time period look like, right? I mean, to a certain extent, they'll have, in the past, they've had an image of the Boston Massacre, right? And if you don't remember when that happened, there's telltale signs as a test taker about generally what was going on. And then it's your goal, if you've memorized these different dates and these different time periods, the AP exam is going to stick to those time periods. The same thing goes when you guys get to the short answer questions in the DBQ. That if you can identify within the DBQ what time period is what's going on, it's going to be much, much easier to extend your reasoning. Because no matter what, when you guys see those types of questions, there's going to be a very high likelihood that the first document that you guys review is not going to be something that's immediately apparent, right? Or when you see a short answer question, it's not going to immediately be like, oh, of course I know the answer to this. Let me just start typing, right? For the digital copy, you guys will be typing through this. Instead, the likelihood is going to be like, oh, I know we kind of talked about that, and especially in this pandemic year, who knows how much has really been covered in classes, different classes. So what your thought process has to be is, what time period, what general time period are we talking about? And what were the historical events that were going on in that time period? What was happening with the United States in that time period, right? From 1607, this was all about the development of the first colonies within the U.S. From 1754 to 1800, this was all about the Revolutionary War, what led up to the Revolutionary War. So if you guys see things like the Boston Tea Party, or you see an image, right, or a document that suggests there's a Boston Tea Party, that's going to tell you right away what was going on during this time period and how the U.S. relations were towards everybody else in the country. And that's ultimately what this test comes down to, is your ability to relate U.S. history or what's going on in the United States to other aspects of the world. Can everybody, again, just say, I understand, or whatever you guys want to say, or a thumbs up in the chat if this all makes sense. If you're just joining us, please just say hello so we know who's here. Andrew, again, thank you for the comments so that I know that you're here. And again, I want you guys to be thinking about this in a much broader sense as to how you can apply, what's going on in U.S. history in this time period, and how the U.S. relates to the French, how they relate to the British. Obviously not well, right? 1754 to 1800 was not good time for British and U.S. relations. Okay, but how does that relate, and what was going on? Who was helping the United States? Who was not helping the United States? Right, the French would have been considered an ally at this point, and the British, and that changes throughout history. Even to the extent of what's going on with the French Revolution and how, right, Napoleon and just after the U.S. Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution took place, and that impacted Thomas Jefferson, right? That impacted what was going on in America and the relationship that we had with France. And you guys need to understand that from a very broad context, because then all of a sudden, when you get to the multiple choice questions, which are very in depth and very hard, much harder than anything that you'd see on the SAT or the ACT for sure. Then when you get to those questions, you're able to reason through that in a far more broad, right, or far more contextual way than what you might be able to do in a more objective, from a more objective standpoint. Okay, does that all make sense? And then I'm going to get into the scoring of the AP and AP US History and how you can, how that's so effective, how this idea of outlining which time periods within US history you know best. And hopefully you guys have a sense of that now because you guys have been studying on your own with the content. But I would highly recommend, and this is something that we have all of our students that we work with individually for AP US History, this is something we have every one of them do, is to outline, and we help a little bit with this, but outline which of the time periods that you feel most comfortable. Which ones do you know the best as you've gone through your content review? Because if you understand that, then you're going to know which questions are most important for you, the ones that you don't want to miss. Whereas if you come to a question, you have absolutely no idea what's going on, right? Like for me, that time period would be right here. The 1800 to 1854 is just like is blank, right? And same thing, really, and this is why this period 7 that they give you in the AP US History on College Board, the reason this time period is so long, right? 1890 period 7 from 1945, is because other than Teddy Roosevelt at the beginning of the 20th century, 1905, somewhere in there, from 1890 to 1905, there wasn't a ton going on, and then from Teddy Roosevelt till 1920 with women's suffrage, or rather at the end of the World War I, right, and then women's suffrage. There's not a ton going on in that period. There's a few big moments, but not nearly as much as from 1754 to 1800. That's almost a full influence of American history. And again, that's why it's so important to outline which periods you know best, so that you can really understand what's going on and understand, okay, is there a lot of content in this time period, or is there very little time content, so that I'm not overthinking a question if I see something related to 1894, right, or something like that. It's important, and again, what I'm trying to do with this live stream is give you guys some effective techniques between now and actual test time that you can go through, not to go over every piece of content that you could possibly see, although I'm happy to do that. If you have any general questions about content or a time period that we have listed out here, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But those are going to be more specific questions. What I'm really looking for is to have you guys understand how you can best prepare between now and Wednesday if you're taking the test on the 19th, or between now and if you're going to take the test at the beginning of June. Okay? Does that all make sense, guys? Can everybody give me a thumbs up, guys, if that makes sense? Thumbs up if that makes sense. And then beyond that, I am going to give you guys some hints or some thoughts about potentially what's best, what to best cover. Okay, what's a best cover in terms of each time period, or maybe more importantly, which time periods are the most relevant. Which ones generally have the most number of questions? Now, the digital exam throws a complete wrench into this equation. From what we know about the written exam, this is certainly true, and I think it's going to be true with the digital exam as well, because they did administer written exams this year. So I can't imagine that they'd be able to change it, because otherwise the test wouldn't be, unique. All right, so before I get into each time period, before I get into each explanation of the time periods, this is the other thing that I want you guys to recognize and to realize. The AP US History test is graded on a curve. Okay, it's graded on a curve. If you guys are interested, this is what the curve looks like, right? Something like this. Okay. I think this one, everything that we know about the AP US History test would say that it's graded on a bell curve, although it might be a little bit different because there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, obviously. Generally, like right, we'd see 1, and this would be the certain number of students. 3 would be, actually I think 2 is closer to the average, the national average, so I think it's actually more like, something like maybe this would be 2, okay? And this, of course, is the number of students that qualify that would fall into these different line numbers. This is 4, this is 5. And so what I want you to recognize is that this test is still graded against your peers, right? The 5 scale is still graded against your peers. Who else, right? Who else has achieved a certain level of, and that's all based on how difficult the test is and what the College Board determines. But what I want you to recognize is that a 5, right, is not equivalent to what a 93%, right, would be in school. In school, when you take a U.S. history test, and in large part it's unfair. That's why you guys are, most of you that take the AP U.S. history course in high school, that's why it's graded on a 5.0 scale. Because most teachers still assign like a 93% grade on a real AP U.S. history practice test is still based on a percentage score. But it's not the case. That's not the case when you sit down and take the real AP U.S. history exam. And this is true for all AP exams, by the way, as well. But it's still graded on a curve. And the reason I bring all of this up, especially as it relates to everything we discussed just a second ago about the different periods and which period is the one that you know the best, remember that you don't need to get every question right in order to achieve a 5 on the AP U.S. history test. That doesn't mean that you don't need to study. That doesn't mean that you don't need to be paying attention to this video or paying attention to your teacher in school. But what it does mean is that we need to be efficient and still be great test takers, just like we talk about in every one of our SAT and ACT videos. Nothing changes with any AP exam, right, including this AP U.S. history exam. But if you watched all of our AP Calc videos, we talk a lot about how you need to be the most efficient test taker you can be. And that does not mean that you sit there on a question that is very difficult or one that you do not know. Okay, that's very, very, very critical as we start to go through this. And it's going to be even more important because remember, on this digital exam, I assume this is correct because we haven't heard anything different from the College Board. I posted a link earlier about how the College Board is not allowing you to go back on questions, right? It's not allowing you to go back to questions that you haven't seen previously, or sorry, that you have seen previously. Okay, and they're saying that that's for security purposes, and in some ways I understand that. But if they're not going to allow you to go back, that creates another kind of conundrum that we have to work through in terms of your strategy come test day. Okay, does that all make sense? And it relates directly to this 5. So just like you guys are very familiar with, right, there's a multiple choice. There's going to be multiple choice on the test. There's going to be short answer questions. There's going to be more short answer questions and a DBQ. Okay, and these are going to be broken up. You guys are going to have breaks between each one, but we can kind of qualify each one of these, right? We can kind of qualify each one of these as its own separate section, or that we're going to assume that each of these sections can be taken and that they're all going to apply in different weighted averages towards your overall score. And let me actually, I have the rubric for that, so let me just post that as well. So, hey guys, so generally speaking, generally speaking, guys, a 5 constitutes, let's call it maybe the top 15%. Okay, so when we talk about this 5, and what I want you to recognize is that if you're in the top, let's say 13 to 15% to 15% of all students who take the AP U.S. history exam, kind of depending on the year, as you guys know from from our ACT and SAT discussions, the scales vary a little bit from year to year. And again, who knows what they're going to do with these digital copies of the exam this year, just because I think they know how difficult this year has been and potentially how much less you were probably able to cover in a class. But let's just say for the sake of the video, with a written test, you're typically in the top 13 to 15% of all students that take the test to get a 5. Now, what I want you to think about is that usually we would associate a 5 with like a 95%, right, which is an A. But what I'm telling you is that a 5 on this test, or at least historically, has been the equivalent of an 80, let's call it a B, right, an 85%, just for the sake of the video. Okay, it's equivalent to an 85%. And again, what that means and it goes back to all of the discussions that we've had about test taking and how to be the best test taker you can be, is that basically you get a 10% bump, right? You get a 10% bump in your score just for sitting down to take the test. That's huge, right? That gives you a huge advantage if you know that. Okay, it gives you a huge advantage if you know that and you can apply that well. Can everybody give me a thumbs up? Do we have any general questions about anything we've discussed today so far? Any general questions about any of the things we've discussed today so far? Then we're going to take it just even one step further. And again, it's going to be a little bit different, but I'm going to talk historically about how the written test has been graded, and I assume because the written test was administered this year and the digital test was administered, I'm assuming that those are going to be, just a weird year. They don't typically do that, obviously. Who knows but historically, okay, how the test has been administered is that there's some combination of the multiple choice being 40% of your overall score, okay, and then the let's call it just essay questions, right? Long essay questions, short answer essay, short essays. So LEQ, right, and DBQ. Let's just say EQ and then DBQ have historically been has been 60% of your overall score. And so that's really important because what it tells us is that what we used to recommend to students as they went through this test is that you of course would scan through every single question. Once you got to the any short answer or LEQ or DBQ questions, like the DBQ and the LEQ used to be done at the same time. And I think that they will be, I think that the short answer this year for the digital copy and a DBQ instead of an LEQ and a long DBQ. But we used to have students scan through all of the essays to make sure that they knew which ones that they knew best, right? And this kind of goes back to that period 1, period 2, period 3. However, if you on the digital copy, you guys are not allowed to go back to previous questions. Now that throws us into a little bit of a conundrum because it means that we have to almost on the fly determine do we really know what appears on the test. Okay? But there are a couple things that you want to recognize. One is that the multiple choice questions are not worth, one question is not worth more than another. Okay? So regardless of how this thing, again, it's a weird year in terms of the digital copy and all that, but regardless of how this thing turns out, every multiple choice question worth the same. Okay? And what we always say is that there are going to be questions on this test that you really know well, and there are going to be other questions that you have no idea what they're talking about. Then there's a middle ground, and this is the one that gets tricky. Even if you can't go back to a question, right? Even if you're not allowed to go back to a question like you would be in previous years on this digital copy, that's how they're going to secure it, apparently. But if you're not allowed to go back on a question, you need to make the assessment. Do I really know it, right? You should even write this down because it's particularly true of the multiple choice questions. These are kind of the three questions you ask when you get to a multiple choice. Do I already know the answer? Do I already know it? And that's hopefully every one of these questions, right? That would be ideal. Do I already know it? Question number 2, if I thought about it, right? Do I know the general time period? Okay, so this is again. We'll do it by a color choice here. Okay, so if you say, do I already know it? That's a yes, right? If you say yes to that, or I already do know it, that's an absolute yes. Then let's say that this one, do I know the time period, right? That's more of kind of a yellow light situation where you got to be, and that's where you can get a little, that's where it can get a little tricky. Do I know the time period? Do I know the time period? If you find yourself in that situation, but you're not nearly as confident with the overall question, that's where you got to be really careful because those are the types of questions that we can just linger over and over again and be thinking, I remember my teacher talking about that, right? I'm sitting there for what seems like hours. And if you know the general time period, then you should be able to kind of systematically work through, okay, this is the time period. Maybe even write this down in some of your notes, guys. Right? Here's the time period. Here's the time period. Okay? here's what's happening in that time period. And again, this is where if you assess how well you know each time period before the test on Wednesday, if you're taking it on Wednesday, that can be super beneficial. Here's here's what's going on. Here are the events of the time period. The events of the time period. Okay, here are the events of the time period. And then finally, does this help me answer the question? Right? Does this help me eliminate answer choices? Let's say that. Does this help me eliminate answers? And if it does help you eliminate answers, then there's a certain level of yes, I want to try to work through this. And guys, can everybody give me a thumbs up? I know that we haven't had as much, typically with our ACT and SAT reviews, we've had students in and out of the live stream, which is totally fine. But with our ACT and SAT reviews, we typically always ask students if they have any questions. If you have any questions, guys, or if you're just joining us, can you just give me a thumbs up or a hello in the chat, just so we know who's here. If you have any general questions, don't hesitate to post those questions within the chat. Okay, but again, we're coming back to this idea of, does this help me eliminate answer choices? And if it does, if you can quickly make those assessments on a multiple choice question, then you should maybe spend a little bit of time on it, right, to get it down to 2 answer choices. But if you have no idea after asking yourself those 3 questions, if you have no idea about the time period, about what in the world is going on in the time period, about how those events of the world relate to the United States during that time period, then you gotta kind of cut your losses and just continue to move. Because the third one is, right, this third level, that we're talking about in terms of your knowledge of multiple choice is, I have no idea what they're talking about. I have no idea what they are saying. Right? I have no idea what they're saying. And again, in years past, this has been a lot easier strategy. So I just want to clarify that, because if the digital copy the digital exam doesn't allow you to go back, then this last one is the difference between 2 and 3 is very different than it was in years past. And I want you guys to think about that and how you can strategize personally going into Wednesday, or into the June test. Let me pull this up, guys. Right, going into the June test, I want you guys to think about how you can personally strategize with that, because there's a fine line between, if I really think about it, do I know what's going on with this time period, right? That's where we want to outline our overall thought processes for each time period. We want to give kind of a rank as to how comfortable we feel, how confident we are. And there's a fine line between, if I thought about it, I think I could come up with the right thought process here. There's a difference between that and, I have absolutely no idea. And that's a very fine line to balance. And again, when it's a time test and when you can't go back on questions, that is a balance that you need to think about, that you need to know about, that you need to understand, and that you need to try to be able to apply come strategy time when you take the real test. Because once again, on this test, you have, just starting out, you have a 10% percentage bump, right? What feels like a B is going to end up being a 5 on the AP US History test. What feels like a B is going to end up being a 5. It's going to be an A. And that's how you have to come across this. That's how you have to think about this. Otherwise, you're going to be in a situation, I think, where you don't, right, where you're sticking to questions too long, and by the time you move on, you realize, I already kind of didn't know that answer. It was already a little bit of a guess. And I'm still in the same position I am, and this next question was really easy. I wish I would have saved time for this one and maybe the following one, even if it means that I had to skip the one that was really difficult that I didn't understand. And again, that goes back to just test taking in general. It's just a very different test from what you would see in our ACT and SAT videos. And this, by the way, should be a big X mark here if you guys are taking notes. Right? This is very different than what you'd see in our ACT and SAT videos, primarily because you can go back, primarily because the content is very repetitive and there's a lot less of it. In AP US History, there's a lot of content to cover. I mean, you're talking 600 years, right, of content. So you really need to understand, in these time periods, do I understand if this time period is very important? And just to give you guys even more context, here are the very important American history time periods. Very, very important. Period 3. Okay, that's one of the most important, if not the most important, to know not only the way that we describe to our students, very important, is describing it as the entirety of this 1754 to 1800, the entirety of the events during this time, something is happening. It's not like one big event happens and then you kind of get a lull and there's events, but it's not really that big of a deal in the long run towards American history. So period 3 has every single year from 1754 to 1800 essentially has some major event happening as it applies to today's America. Okay, in terms of the Constitution, right, the Bill of Rights. That's all very important. The establishment of the colonies, the Declaration of Independence, of course, the Revolutionary War. All of that's very important. The relationship that we have with France and Napoleon and the French Revolution. Okay, so that's the first one that you should really try to understand. Of course, the next one is period 5, 1854 to 1877, as this includes the assassination of President Lincoln, right? It includes the Civil War. It includes the Reconstruction. Okay, so this is a very important period as well, period 5. And then it's difficult to say, but it's really the end of period 7, right? Maybe from 1820, period 7, 1820 from the 1817 is when we entered World War II. So let's even say in period 7, it's pretty broad because from 1890, like I said, to 1817, other than Teddy Roosevelt a little bit and America's expansion west, there's a lot less U.S. history in that time. And I realize that I'm probably making too much of a generalization there. But there is, relatively speaking, it's not like the period 3 or period 5 where basically every year something is happening in that time period. For the U.S., it's really from 1917, at the end of World War I, when the Americans entered, to 1945. That's really the part of period 7 where there's a whole bunch of different historical events happening, and those are the most important, right? Those are the years that are most important. So make sure that you brush up on those time periods, right? All of these three, 1754 to 1800. If there's any content that you're going to review between now and Wednesday's test or the June test, this is the time periods to do it. And to really understand historically what's going on, because I can't tell you how often we see, long essay questions or DBQs in the past, or short answer questions or multiple choice questions that deal with those 3 time periods, because frankly, there's just so many different types of questions that you could come up with for those time periods versus, again, from in 1690 relative to 1776 or 1858, right? There's so much less going on in 1690 than there is in 1776 and 1858. And that's what you have to recognize. So those are the content periods that I would study between now and Wednesday if I were you. Okay, those are the most important ones. Period 3, period 5, and the end of period 7. Especially if you haven't covered this one, this is always one that teachers always struggle to get to at the end of the year. That and the Cold War. They probably will ask you about the Cold War, which is 1945 to like 1990. They'll probably ask you, that might be an essay question. And then everything after 1990 or so is always only multiple choice. They might ask you about the Clinton administration, maybe about the Bush administration, but that's almost always multiple choice. Very rarely, or at least, I guess historically, I'm getting older, but historically they've asked fewer questions about stuff like that because students are much more familiar with that time period because you've actually lived through a lot of that. Obama years, even Obama's presidency is even fewer from our experience in the past. Okay, so again, these are the years that you really want to think about and cover, and I would honestly try to map out these time periods, maybe not year by year, but almost to year by year, about what's happening in the world, what's happening in the U.S., and how the U.S. is related both domestically, what's happening internally in the United States as a country, and then how our relations are outside. Because like in 1917 to 1945, that time period, the relationships outside of the U.S., right, our foreign policy is far more important than our domestic policy at that time. But in 1754, well, maybe not right after we declare independence and we break away from Britain, okay, then from like 1780 to 1789 or to 1800, the domestic policy is much more important. And then in 1854, with everything with Lincoln and the Civil War, everything is domestic, right? That's the most important part, is the domestic policy. So you guys really have to understand that as a whole context. in order to try to understand, because then when you get to the multiple choice questions, which are not nearly as objective as anything you'd see on a SAT or ACT exam, they're not nearly as objective. They're asking you much broader questions like, who would we have expected? They'll ask you a question about a person. A person makes a statement. Thomas Paine might make a statement, or who else? Paul Revere, right? They might bring up a quote. And if you don't know who those general people are or what they might be talking about in that time period, then it's going to be really hard to answer that question, right? They might ask you about Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points, okay, and how that's how the League of Nations started, which was the precursor to the United Nations. And those are little things that if you understand when Woodrow Wilson was the president, you're going to understand what's going on in the world, why the League of Nations would be necessary after World War I, why the League of Nations didn't end up working out, and why the United Nations ended up becoming a thing after the Second World War. And again, those are the things that you really want to focus on from a broad context, because if you know the general events of those time period, then when you get to the multiple choice questions or the short answer questions or the DBQ, you're going to be very, very familiar with this broad context, which then can be much easier, right? It's much easier. Think about writing a paper. It's way easier to write a 10-page paper and cut it down to 5 than it is to get to 5 pages, have no more content to write about, and try to expand it to 10. Okay, it's much, much easier. Expanding a paper, you just start filling in things that don't really matter. So have the broad context and then narrow it down to what they're specifically talking about or asking about when you get to the real test. All right? So again, I hope that, does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any questions related to this test overall? Any general questions related to the exam? The AP exam, anything about history in general, time period in general? My goal in this was to give you an example of what to expect on the exam and how you can prepare with not a ton of time left, right? Between now and Wednesday, if you're taking it on the 19th, or now in the beginning of June. There's still not a ton of time to prepare, and there's so many other things going on in your lives right now, and it's so crazy, especially if you live in the U.S. Well, if you live anywhere, right? The world has been affected by the pandemic, and it's getting back to school, and this year has just been crazy. So there's a lot of things going on, and my goal with this live stream and providing some of this information to you guys is to help you potentially go from a 4 to a 5. Right? A lot of the U.S. history test is going to be about you and your ability to memorize content. That's just history in general. And then interpret that content, but you have to have the content before you can interpret it. That's a lot of this test. But if you have all of that and you're on the cusp of a 4 to a 5, a lot of the things that we talked about in terms of general test taking can be really, really effective as it relates to everything we talked about today. And it can also be implemented very quickly in terms of your general understanding of this test. So again, it doesn't look like anybody has any questions. If you guys do have questions later, after you've had a chance to watch the video, or if you have questions while you're watching and you want to pause it and comment below, you can absolutely do that. If you please let us know by commenting, because then our teachers and tutors will answer those questions always, as we do for all of our SAT and ACT videos. Otherwise, everybody, I hope you learned a lot. First and foremost, I hope these strategies and this idea, the general formatting of this test and what to expect, helps you on test day. And as always, we hope to see you guys soon. Our next several live streams will be going back to the ACT and the SAT questions and live streams leading up to those June ACT and SAT exams. But before that, if you have any questions about these AP exams or just general questions, please don't hesitate to comment below. We'd love to answer those questions. We can't tell you how much we appreciate all of your support. We'd love it if you guys could subscribe to the channel and help us spread the word. If you're interested in joining the channel for more premium content, click the join button below this video. And otherwise, guys, we'll see you soon for the next live stream, and we hope you guys rock the test. You guys are all going to get 5s. We know it. Stick to this plan, and keep working hard. You guys are almost through one of the toughest academic school years that's probably since World War II, to be honest, talking about U.S. history, right? Talk about U.S. history. Since World War II, and you guys, it's amazing how well you guys have persevered and battled through that, so keep it up. You're almost to the finish line. Otherwise, guys, we'll see you guys in a few days for our next live stream. All right, have a great rest of your day. Have a great night. Have a great day wherever you are in the world, guys. Thanks. Talk to you soon.